You've probably eaten this dish at least once with no idea you are eating an insult. For over a century, Americans have poured a thick, peppery white gravy over warm biscuits and called it comfort food. Diners serve it, grandmothers guard their recipe for it. Waffle House built a menu around it. But the name most cooks still use for that gravy, Sawmill gravy, was reportedly born as a joke aimed at the person who made it, mocking her most closely guarded technique as nothing more than sawdust in a pan. So who actually built this dish? Who turned cheap scraps into something people are still eating 150 years later? And why does almost nobody know her name? Start with the biscuit, because the biscuit almost wasn't food. Some food writers trace this dish all the way back to the Revolutionary War, when soldiers reportedly softened hard flour and water rations with pan drippings to stretch thin meat supplies. It's a tidy origin story. It's also, according to most culinary historians, almost certainly a myth, a comforting legend with no primary evidence behind it, invented long after the fact to give an unglamorous dish a patriotic pedigree. The truth is less flattering and more interesting. For most of American history, a biscuit wasn't the pillowy thing you're picturing. It was closer to hardtack, a flour and water puck baked hard enough to survive weeks in a sailor's trunk or a soldier's pack. Sailors chipped their teeth on it. Soldiers soaked it in whatever liquid was on hand just to choke it down. The word itself comes from the Latin for twice cooked, and for most of its existence, that's exactly what it tasted like: punishment food, built for shelf life, not pleasure. Here's the betrayal at the center of this chapter. The food we now associate with cozy Sunday mornings started life as something closer to survival gear. Nobody was eating it for comfort. They were eating it because the alternative was starving. That changed for one simple, unglamorous reason: chemistry. In the mid-1800s, baking soda and then commercial baking powder became widely available across the American South for the first time. Combined with newly abundant, better-milled flour, this gave home cooks something they'd never had: a reliable way to make bread rise without yeast, without time, without skill most people didn't have. The rock-hard cracker of a biscuit had a path to becoming soft. But a soft biscuit still needed something to make it worth eating, and that's where the story turns toward the mountains. Picture southern Appalachia in the years right after the Civil War. The region is poor, and it's about to get poorer before it gets richer. Northern timber companies are buying up mountain forests, and a new industry is exploding across Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina: the sawmill. Sawmill work was brutal, low-paying, and physically punishing. Men felling trees and running dangerous saw blades from before dawn until after dark, burning enormous amounts of energy for wages that barely covered flour and salt pork. Camps needed food that was cheap, filling, and fast, and that food had to come from somewhere. It came from camp kitchens, and reportedly many of those kitchens were run by black women, some of them formerly enslaved cooks who had learned to cook in plantation big houses before emancipation. One name surfaces faintly in a handful of Tennessee logging camp payroll ledgers and in oral histories collected decades later by folklorists: Ailsy. The record on her is thin: a wage entry here, a half-remembered family story passed down there, and any details about her life beyond that have to be treated as partial reconstruction, not settled fact. But cooks like her, working camp kitchens across the region in the 1870s and 1880s, are where culinary historians now believe this dish actually took shape. Imagine standing in that kitchen before sunrise, wood smoke thick in the air, a cast-iron skillet already hot, the sharp, fatty smell of pork sausage rendering down to a shallow pool of grease, the only budget this cook has to work with. 50 hungry men are about to walk through that door expecting breakfast, and there is nowhere near enough meat to feed them. So she reaches for flour. Here's where the story flips.
The gravy that came out of that skillet wasn't a happy accident. According to food historians who've traced the technique, it followed the exact structural logic of one of the 5 so-called mother sauces of classical French cuisine, bechamel. Fat, cooked together with flour into a roux, then loosened with milk into a smooth, thickened sauce. It's the same base technique behind lasagna's white layer and a proper French gratin. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a compliment history has been eager to hand out. Plantation kitchens in the antebellum South were often where enslaved cooks were trained, sometimes directly, sometimes by absorbing techniques from imported French-trained chefs or French-influenced cookbooks in exactly this kind of European technique, because the food served in the big house was expected to mimic European refinement. When emancipation came, that knowledge didn't vanish. It walked out the door with the people who'd been forced to learn it, and it turned up wherever they cooked next, including, it appears, in a sawmill camp kitchen with nothing but pork fat, flour, and milk to work with. So the dish now stereotyped as unrefined, working-class, poor man's food was at its technical core a mother sauce of French haute cuisine, smuggled out of a slaveholder's kitchen and repurposed to feed the poorest laborers in Appalachia. The sauce didn't get less sophisticated when it moved to the sawmill. It got more essential. The texture alone told a story. Silky where the biscuit was rough, rich where the meat ration was thin, peppery enough to wake a man up before a 12-hour shift with a saw blade. One layer of technique, hiding under a very plain name. And that plain name is where things get uncomfortable. Remember the open question from the top of this video? Why a dish this good carries a name that started as an insult? Here's what the record suggests. To stretch the gravy even further, cooks like Ailsy reportedly thickened it not just with flour, but with cornmeal, coarser, cheaper, more available in a mountain economy where corn grew easily and wheat flour had to be haul-in. According to accounts passed down through camp oral history, the loggers noticed the gritty texture and started joking that the cook must be putting sawdust in their food instead of cornmeal. The sawmill was everywhere, in their hair, their boots, their lungs. Why not their breakfast, too? The name stuck, sawmill gravy. What began as a jab at a woman's cooking became, within a generation, the accepted term for the dish across the entire region. This is where the stakes of this story actually live, not in a battle or a fortune, but in something quieter and more permanent: credit. The technique survived, the name survived, twisted into a joke nobody remembers was ever aimed at anyone. What didn't survive, in almost any written record, was the acknowledgement that a formerly enslaved woman took a French mother sauce and rebuilt it from nothing to feed 50 hungry strangers a day. That's the thing that was actually at risk of being lost forever, and largely it was. Cornmeal-thickened sawmill gravy is technically a slightly different, older cousin of the smooth, all-flour sausage gravy most people eat today. But the name outlived the distinction. Order biscuits and sawmill gravy almost anywhere in the American South right now, and you'll likely get the flour version, the joke's descendant, still on the menu, the insult now worn as a badge of regional pride. Sawmill gravy didn't stay alone for long, and here's a second betrayal, smaller than the first. The version most people now think of as the biscuits and gravy was never the only option, or even necessarily the original one. Coastal Virginia and North Carolina developed oyster gravy, built around the Chesapeake's abundant shellfish. Deep South kitchens produced okra gravy and corn gravy. Somewhere along the way, someone in the mountains got creative enough to invent chocolate gravy, a sweet, cocoa-thickened sauce poured over biscuits that reportedly still shows up on Appalachian breakfast tables today. And in households built around ham instead of sausage, cooks poured the pan drippings from a fried ham steak into a hot skillet with black coffee, deglazing it into a thin, dark, intensely savory sauce called red-eye gravy. No flour, no milk, no roux at all. Each of these was solving the exact same problem Ailsy was solving in that Sawmill camp. How do you make a cheap, hard biscuit worth eating when meat is scarce and money is scarcer? Pork was, according to food historians Heather Arndt Anderson, considered the South's poor man's protein for most of this era, abundant, low status, and exactly the kind of ingredient that gets transformed into something extraordinary by someone with nothing else to work with. But sawmill gravy, later smoothed out into what most Americans now just call sausage gravy or white gravy, became the version that spread the furthest, and it spread for a specific reason: economics. Pork, flour, and milk, according to food historian Heather Arndt Anderson, were exactly the ingredients that remained affordable and available to poor Southern households in this period, in a way that other proteins simply weren't. The most economically accessible version of the dish became the version that won. Through the early to mid-1900s, biscuits and gravy stayed largely regional, a Southern breakfast tied to Southern poverty, rarely seen on menus above the Mason-Dixon line. That began to change with something almost aggressively unglamorous: the diner. In 1955, a small restaurant chain opened in Avondale Estates, Georgia, built around waffles and eggs served around the clock. Waffle House put biscuits and gravy on that menu from the start, and as the chain expanded, eventually past 2,000 locations, it carried the dish with it into every state it touched, standardizing something that had once varied kitchen to kitchen into something a traveler could order identically at 2 in the morning in Ohio or Texas. Picture that: a truck driver pulling off an interstate at 3 a.m., sliding into a vinyl booth under fluorescent light, ordering the same peppery gravy that started in a Tennessee logging camp over a century earlier, with no idea of the woman or the borrowed French technique that made it possible. Television did the rest. Food shows built entire episodes around oversized, photogenic plates of biscuits and gravy, treating it as shorthand for small-town American comfort. The dish that once marked you as too poor to afford real meat became decades later a symbol of nostalgic authenticity that people now actively seek out. That's the quiet reversal hiding inside this chapter. Poverty food doesn't just get tolerated over time. Sometimes it gets rebranded as the thing everyone's chasing.